Good morning and welcome back to my video series where I'm taking the philosophical concepts from medical Heilkunst, but demonstrating how they apply to life as a whole. You don't need to be taking homeopathic medicines and Heilkunst medicines to be benefiting from this philosophy, but it really becomes a foundational philosophy for how to live life in much broader terms, in a more expansive, alive way. So anyways, if you were with me in last week's video, I'm going to be continuing from the point where we left off. Do stay with this video to the end, but you'll probably want to go back and review last week's video to get the bigger context that I won't be able to all fit in here. I would just end up repeating everything I said last week all over again this week. So we don't want to do that. But what I do want to do actually is I want to spend say a minute and a half. I just want to point out some of the key points that were in last week's video, and we'll carry on from there. And as I say, you can watch that previous video and get a much more expanded version of what I'm about to say. So let me just put my notes up here on the screen so I can share that with you. So, so that's right. So we, good thing I have notes so I remember where I'm going. So where I started with last week's video, I'm actually going to repeat it verbatim this time, and that is the opening quote from oops, that is the wrong app. An opening quote from a book by Georg Kuhlewitz, the book called The Logo Structure of the World. And the opening quote is just the following: "This book aims to show that the world, including human beings and their consciousness, is not originally a world of things, but a world of words, that fundamentally it is structured like a text and can therefore be read like a text." So as I said, I did go into this last time. I'm not going to go through that all again, but the main point to take from that is what he's not saying. He's not telling us that this whole business of the world being made up of words. He's not saying that it's simply human consciousness using words to understand a material world, but rather what he's saying is that the very nature of language and words and concepts is the very fundamental reality of the world, and us coming to understand that is really a language word thing, and it's not a physics thing in the sense of studying subatomic particles and things like that. So anyways, we started last week with that, and let me just make a couple of more points that we said last week, and that was, or the main thing that I wanted to bring from last week is this distinction here between the language which is seen as nominalism versus the language which is seen as disclosure. I have that up in these notes up here, the nominalism and the disclosure. And what that means is, in the nominalistic worldview, language is reduced to be basically a label or a tool. Humans are seen as being tool users. We build tools to help us do things, and language in the nominalistic worldview is seen that way. It's seen as a tool which helps us to kind of carve our way through reality, as it were, which is well and good. That's partially true, but that's not fundamentally true. And that's where we talked last week about the whole language of disclosure, where we have this deeper understanding of language, that it doesn't, language isn't something that we add to the world, but in fact, language is the very thing through which the world is given to us. The world discloses itself to us through language. Anyways, if you review last week's video, I go more into depth of that, but I wanted to come back to where we ended last week and pick up from there. We ended here. I was talking about Helen Keller's epiphany, but when she first was learning sign language, and the depths of the world that was revealed to her in that moment. And actually, I'm going to read that part of her autobiography today. It's oops, and not there. Too many windows, right? Yeah, here we are. Yeah, so just reading from her biography, I'm just going to read out this excerpt, but I think it'll be pretty self-explanatory. Her tutor was named Sullivan. That was her last name. I forget her first name. Is it right here? Anyways, we'll just use her last name. Sullivan spelled words into Helen's hand and tried to help the girl connect letters and words with objects' names. At first, Helen thought her teacher was just playing a game. Helen memorized words but failed to understand that they did, in fact, have meaning. So this, right here, even in this first paragraph I just read, that already starts to disprove the idea of nominalism and the way that children learn language. It's assumed that children learn language in a nominalistic way, like just the way, Helen was saying right here that she was not learning, right? She wasn't picking up what the teacher was trying to teach at that level, that nominalistic level. But I'll go on here. It wasn't until April the 5th, 1887, when Anne Sullivan, when Anne took Helen to an old pump house, that Helen finally understood that everything has a name. Sullivan put Helen's hand under the stream and began spelling water into her palm, first slowly, then more quickly. Keller later wrote in her autobiography, as the cool stream, as the cool stream gushed over one hand, she spelled into the other the word water, first slowly, then rapidly. I stood still, my whole attention fixed upon the motions of her fingers. Suddenly, I felt a misty consciousness as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that water meant the wonderful cool something that was flowing over my hand. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, set it free. There were barriers still, it is true, but barriers that could in time be swept away. Sullivan described the event in a letter to the matron of the Perkins School. The word coming so close upon the sensation of the cold water rushing over her hand seemed to startle her. She dropped the mug and stood as one transfixed. A new light came into her face. That phrase is so revealing, right? A new light came into her face. Keller began asking what the words for other objects were and learned dozens of new words in the following days. From that breakthrough moment, Helen's world continued to expand. She learned to read, write, and even speak. So this is amazing, an amazing excerpt. And back to my main point, it doesn't, or what it does do is it contradicts the nominalistic worldview, which would tell us that children learn language as if they're just learning the names of things, as if we're babies and we're looking around at the world, thinking to ourselves, oh, I wonder what that's called. I wonder what that's called. Well, that's not where our consciousness is at before we acquire language. And there was another phrase in that Helen Keller passage. I forget the exact phrasing, but there was something she had just said, which was along the lines of kind of reawakening this whole world, almost as if coming back to a world we had previously belonged to, but we had to rediscover. This is the nature of learning language. We're rediscovering this disclosive nature of language, where these words are pointing to this very generative. That was another word I talked about last week. This very generative function of language in our consciousness, where we learn to actually co-create along with reality. We, as I say, we don't just point at things and figure out what is that called, but the very act of acquiring the language is that part of our consciousness, just like we just read in Helen Keller, where that whole world is very vividly awakened in us, where we, the activity of language, as I'm saying, is disclosive, and it's pointing to this activity of consciousness, which is we are kind of creating our world around us as we are becoming conscious of it. The consciousness is a disclosive act, as I'm saying, it's a generative act, but it's not a static nominalistic act. It's not just a matter of pointing at something, having a baby, pointing at something and saying the word to the baby. The baby isn't just sitting there, as I said, just waiting for, I hope somebody tells me the name of that. But at first, we first have to have that disclosive phenomenal experience, where we even start, originally start having that experience that there is a world that we are participators in. And then yes, we use the words, we use names, we use language, and then at that point where Helen Keller said, then she just became hungry. She started to understand this fundamental reality of how we are in the world and everything, and she started to ask for other words. But we can't ask for words at the beginning because we can't even have that consciousness that there are words to be asked for. Like our mind isn't working like that. But anyways, that's that original process we all go through. As I said, this Helen Keller biography really makes this very vivid and alive for us to understand it. But we all go through that, and this kind of brings us to the main thing we're talking about here, this disclosive nature of language and reality. So let's go a little bit further now into today's notes. So this is, and I've talked about this in a previous video, but I'm kind of coming back to it in this more specific way around the nature of language, this concept of living thinking. So this experience that Helen Keller had, and then we all have, this, and as I said, we have that very primal experience originally, and that's always there. It's always at the basis of our consciousness and the basis of our language and how we use it and everything. We tend to fall into that more nominalistic appreciation of reality. We, especially if we've ever tried to learn a second language, that tends to be what we think. We start here in English, maybe we go off to learn French or Spanish or some other language, and that's usually how we learn that other language, is we start asking, okay, what's the French word for this? What's the French word for that? We think that we need to do that in a nominalistic way, and that actually slows down a lot of people's attempts at language learning, because they're doing that in that presumed nominalistic way. But this is where all the advice of language learning points us, is that we learn much more deeply and much more quickly if we have the opportunity to do it in an immersive way, which can really bring us more in contact with that primal disclosive aspect of language. So, as they say, if you can go to the country where they speak that language, if you can, as much as possible, not use your original language and try to really live and learn and experience everything in that other language, it's going to be a much deeper and a much quicker experience. But anyways, that's just another example of where this disclosive aspect of language brings us into much more direct contact with reality than the presumed nominalistic way. So this living thinking, as I say, we have access to it. It's always at base, but we need to, in a more kind of waking, kind of proactive way, really make that kind of a dynamic part of our consciousness, and not just something that's happening kind of under the surface and we don't even realize it's happening. We want to realize it's happening, and we want to take advantage of that. So I think, as I said a couple of minutes ago, to formalize this a little bit more, language is not merely a label in the nominalistic sense, but it's a dynamic pointer to the generative unfolding of life. We are generative. We have a generative relationship to life and to all the things we experience, all the things around us. We are co-creating that in that generative sense, and we're not just sitting there passively waiting for the word or the label to tell us what something is. So I'm going to use a Spanish example here, just to show off my very basic Spanish, but just to make my point here, the Spanish phrase here, "Yo como una naranja," in English, that means I am eating an orange. But just to make the point, if we go back into that nominalistic worldview, the nominalistic stance says that, they take this as an example. They say, see, Spanish says, "Yo como una naranja." English says, "I am eating an orange," completely different words. So to them, that proves the point that that these words are just nominalistic. They're just labels. Like over here, people develop this language and they put these words onto reality, and over here, these people develop these English words and they put those onto reality, and to them that proves their point. But in fact, that's not correct. What this, if you understand this dynamic understanding of language, what this example demonstrates is that, in the English side, on the Spanish side, in both instances, whatever whatever language the baby was learning, it wasn't, the important point isn't that what's the words that the baby was learning. Yes, they were learning words, but really what those words were giving the baby was a way of seeing this deeper dynamic aspect of reality as it unfolds as a living process. When we experience the meaning of those words, then would say, okay, now we can connect the meaning to the words. That happened with Helen Keller in the example we read. It's that dynamic meaning that is being given to us, and that we participate when we're in a conversation, when we speak, when we listen. It's that dynamic meaning that the words point to, right? And of course, the whole nominalistic view, that's where the whole the whole aspect of puns and plays on words come from. Those people who really like puns, you can say they're deeply connected into that nominalistic feeling of life, right? It's like, oh yeah, well, if I say this word, it means this in this context, but haha, it means this over in this other context. They're kind of making a joke on the nominalistic premise, which is funny in itself. Actually, there's a really funny there's a Steve Martin, the stand-up comedian and the actor and everything. He has this funny YouTube video. Maybe I should find that. I don't have that at my fingertips here, but he has this whole comedy bit where he's talking about his time in France and kind of having to deal with language and French and everything, and he was saying like pamplemousse, that's their word for grapefruit, and he's saying all these French words, and that's just our word for this in English. And then his punchline was, those French, they just have a different word for everything. Anyways, that's a real nominalistic joke, and I find it funny, but it really gets to the heart of the problem we're grappling with here. Is the nature of language is not nominalistic, as I've been saying, but we have to get underneath the words and the surface of language into this deeper dynamic aspect of what language actually is and what we actually gain from it. So so I can't remember if I brought this quote into a previous video, but if you study the scientific work of Goethe, his work on the theory of color and his work on plant metamorphosis and all these amazing scientific things he did, he was using this much more dynamic approach to nature and reality, and not the static material nominalistic one. So in one of his letters to his friends, when he was in the gardens in Padua, Italy, studying the plants, he wrote back to one of his friends in Germany, and this lovely letter, one of the phrases he wrote was, "I'm learning to read in the book of nature." So it's kind of a startling thing for someone to say. What does that mean, to read in the book of nature? Well, in essence, he was talking about all the things we're talking about here today. He was getting past the superficial observation of, oh yeah, this plant, this flower has this many petals and it's this color, and we can make all these surface observations. But he was coming to this point of starting to see the underlying, what the dynamic meaning was of a given plant, a given flower. Like, he was seeing that dynamic process of the plant as it unfolded in time. So it's, this was the metaphor he was using here. It's as if all the plants or the objects of nature, it's as if those were letters or words in a book we were reading. When we read a book, we don't sit there, like that Helen Keller example that we had at the beginning. We don't just sit there thinking to ourselves, W-A-T-E-R. Oh, I think that's a word that spells water. Oh, and water is, we don't have to go step by step like that. We see the word, when we're fluent in a language, and we have the meaning water. Once we have fluency, we can go, from the letters, the shape of the letters, the word, we can go right through that into this deeper meaning of the water. So this is what Goethe was saying in his observations of the plants and the flowers and everything. He was going from their superficial appearance into this deeper meaning of, what does that plant mean? What does that flower mean? He could see how that moves and flows through, through its metamorphosis in nature over time, and he can see this deeper meaning. So reading in the book of nature, it's a very, very powerful phrase. And to bring this back to ultimately to our big point this morning is, this is where the main point I want to make is, yes, we not only do this when we're doing Heilkund's diagnosis. I was using examples of that in last week's video. It's not just this specialist kind of technique or philosophy that we use for medicine, but what I'm bringing to you today, it's something that you can bring to your day-to-day life, to understanding your life, what's happening in your life, how you're living your life, what's going on around you, and more importantly, what are these deeper these deeper dynamic meanings inside of you that you are meant to bring out into the world. Back in another previous video, not last week, but 2 or 3 weeks ago, we were talking about finding your calling. And when we get into this whole process of living, thinking, and reading in the book of nature, reading, beyond the surface level of things, beyond the surface of language, getting into the deeper meaning of things, you can likewise, as you learn this process of living, thinking, you can learn more and more how to activate this reading of yourself, reading of your life, reading of what you're doing, and really seeing what's going on at the more phenomenological level, at the the deeper level of yourself. Something more dynamic and generative is unfolding in you, and the more you can wake yourself up to the language of this, the more you can kind of consciously direct your life to unfold in the way it's meant to go. Back to when I just said your calling, you can bring more and more of what your calling is supposed to be in your life, and how to manifest that, and how to read the people around you, your relationships, the other broader events, the historical events that we're taking part in right now, the cultural events. You can start to read these at a level that's not just superficial, like, okay, person X did this, and then they said this, and then they said that, then they did this to that person. Well, okay, that's all factually true, but we have to dig deeper to really unfold the meaning of that. So I'll leave today's video here. I think that's a good kind of concluding point. We'll kind of continue this conversation as we go into the next videos, but yeah, I'll just leave that at that. And thank you for joining me this morning. If you're watching this as a replay, you're going to find past videos and future videos in the same place you're finding this one. And I will see you in the next video. Thanks again.